Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Inbar Kobrinsky, and I'm joined here today with Mark Morowczynski. We're both program managers on Azure Active Directory at Microsoft. Today, we are here to talk with you about success strategies for your strong authentication deployment. We will cover this new normal, this reality where we live in, where everyone are working from home, and how this is impacting deployment project as we see it from the customer side, as well as how we see it from our side, from the service side. Then we will talk about key decisions you need to make when you're starting a new authentication deployment. We will cover, obviously, the authentication method that you need to choose, how do you enforce it, but also something that a lot of customer doesn't think about upfront, which is how frequent you want to prompt your users. Then Mark will cover strong authentication deployment tips and day-to-day tricks in managing strong authentication deployment, and we'll finish up with some go-dos and things you can do next week as you start working on your strong authentication deployment. Let's talk about the digital transformation roadmap. You probably know it very well. You have a deployment project and you start with securing the budget for V1 pilot. Then you start testing it, extending it to a small group of users for about 90 days, then moving on to the next phase, securing the budget for that, extending the group of users, and so on and so forth. And we know that those deployment projects can take anywhere from a few months to several years. But in response to COVID, the digital transformation timelines has shrunk dramatically. Companies have enabled remote work and deployed identity security features in a matter of weeks. And if I'm quoting Satya Nadella here, we've just completed more than 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. So this is what we're hearing from customers. But we're also seeing it from our side, from the service side. This slide validates the digital transformation from the identity lens, where we've seen a surge in adoption of cloud authentication due to the shift in remote work. And we've seen more than double the amount of MFA traffic in these months. So we live in this new normal, this new reality where people are shifted to working from remotely. And MFA is a core component in the zero trust strategy that customers are adopting as a result of it. In this zero trust strategy, we know that the old assumptions we had will not keep us secure anymore. We can no longer believe that the corporate network is safe for us and for our users. And we can't keep operating under those old principles. So we need new principles, and the zero trust strategy has 3 core principles, which I'll cover in this slide. First of all, verify explicitly. We're talking about always authenticating and authorizing based on all available data points. It includes the user identity, but it also includes the location, the device health, the resource that they're accessing, data classification, and any anomalies that we see in that. Then we're talking about the least privileged access. And this is where we're talking about just in time or just enough access for users. In the context of Azure AD, and this session specifically, you can think about it as PM, Privileged Identity Management, how you want users to be members in the tenant, but only when they have to do very specific tasks, privileged tasks, they will elevate themselves to a privileged role. And obviously, we want to make sure that they are who they say they are, and we're enforcing strong authentication on them before they take this step. And then finally, assume breach. The corporate network is no longer safe, as I've mentioned before. We want to minimize breaches, and we want to prevent lateral movement by segmenting access to network, users, devices. We need to verify all sessions are encrypted end-to-end, and we need gain visibility to drive threat detection and improve defense. So with these core principles in mind, let's move on to the key decision you need to make or think about when you're starting to plan your strong authentication deployment. I assume you're all here because you made a decision to deploy strong authentication for your users. So you probably know it, you're dealing with 2 competing requirements. From one side, we have the security folks. They are so excited that you're finally enabling MFA on your users. And they're sure they're going to get a lot of security by requiring MFA on every application the user is accessing, every hour, just to get more prompts, more security, and so on. But from the other side, we have the business folks. They're concerned that you're going to block their users from doing their job And maybe you're blocking access to the sales revenue application, maybe it's a legacy application. And you need to think about how do you balance between those two requirements? How do you cause least friction or bring least friction for your users while also keeping them secure? In the next few slides, I will guide you through a few key decisions that will help you to balance between security and usability, and to think about things you want to think about when you deploy strong authentication. The first decision we wanted to talk with you about is authentication frequency. And as I've mentioned, this is not something that customers necessarily think about upfront when they are planning their strong authentication deployment. We want to only prompt users to authenticate when needed. When we prompt users for frequent authentication, we are not necessarily getting more security. In fact, we know that users are getting used to just approving MFA requests without really thinking about it. And we hear it time and time from customers. The attacker has the username and password of a user, and they're hitting the user again and again until finally the user is giving up and approving MFA request. Maybe because they're thinking they're going to lose access to some of their application. This is what we call the MFA fatigue. We really want to make sure that users can associate the MFA request that they're getting with the application that they're accessing or an action that they've been doing. And I want to say that when we're talking about prompting the user when needed, we're saying, yes, when they're going to access a new device, yes, for sure, we will prompt them to authenticate and prove their identity. But it's more a question of, for those devices that you already know and you already manage in your organization, how frequent do you want to prompt your users there? The next key decision you should think about is the authentication method that you're going to use. And this is a fun one. I think we're all here because we agree that passwords are bad and they're no longer enough for us to protect our users. In fact, we know that anything beyond the password significantly increases the cost of attacker, which is why the rate of compromised account using any type of MFA is less than 0.1% for the general population. So let's talk about the different method that you could use. And we'll start with the good column. These are the telecom-based methods. Here we have voice and SMS, and they're definitely better than just using password. But we've seen during COVID that telecom providers have local outages which are preventing from users completing their MFA attempts. In addition, we know that they're vulnerable to very targeted attacks on users, like SIM swapping, for example, and they're definitely not helping with prompts and reducing the friction on the users. Let's talk about the better column. These are the authentication method that does not rely on telecom methods. And here we have the Microsoft Authenticator app, where the user can get a push notification on their device and simply approve or deny the request. Then we have software OTP, which is the time-based one-time passcode, 6 digits that are generated for the users, which can be used using the Microsoft Authenticator app or actually any third-party authenticator app. And finally, we have hardware tokens. These are the tokens that the user carry around. And similar to the software tokens, they generate the 6-digit code for the user, time-based and changing every 30 seconds. All of these methods does not rely on cellular connectivity. Microsoft Authenticator can work if the user have access to wireless network, and software and hardware OTP can also work offline. And then finally, our premier experience, our passwordless methods. And here we have Windows Hello for Business. This works really well for Windows devices. This is the experience where users unlock their device using a gesture or a biometric. And by doing so, it actually providing them with an MFA claim, which is valid when they're authenticating against their application. So this is really good with reducing prompts. The user doesn't really have to see the prompts when they have to do MFA. Then we have the Microsoft Authenticator. And here we have the Microsoft Authenticator as a passwordless method. So in this experience, the user see a number on the screen, and they need to match it with a number that is 3 numbers that they see on their mobile device. This is really great for cross-platform and users who need to use other devices except for Windows. And then finally, we have the FIDO2 key security keys. And if you're here in the Authenticate conference, I'm sure that you've heard about FIDO2 before. I will briefly mention that you can use FIDO2 key as you take the key and put it into the USB. And during sign-in, the user just need to click on the biometric, type their PIN, and they can sign in. So no password at all. If you want to learn more about our passwordless method, we recommend that you go to AKMS/go passwordless. And finally, the third key decision that I want to talk with you about is how do you actually enforce strong authentication on your users? And here the licensing really comes into play. If you have Office 365 licenses or a free Azure AD tenant, which is mostly used for Azure resources, the easiest way for you to enforce MFA on your users will be enabling security defaults in your tenant. That's basically one click, and it will require users in your tenant to register with the Microsoft Authenticator app, and they will be prompted for MFA as needed. Then if you're using Azure AD Premium 1 or EMS E5 or E3, you can use conditional access to require strong authentication. And it starts with different conditions. So conditional access really gives you the granularity to choose specific users and groups, specific location, specific applications, devices, platform, and really allow you to roll out strong authentication gradually. And eventually, hopefully, we can move on to covering all the users, all in the organization under all conditions. And then finally, if you have Azure AD P2 license or EMS E5 license, you can use identity protection in addition to conditional access to enforce strong authentication on your users and basically prompt them based on the risk in their sign-in or the risk that the user have. These are signals that we're getting online from the sign-in itself, for example, unfamiliar location of the user, as well as just offline signals that we're getting from different data sources. And you can decide, for example, if the sign-in has medium risk, you require the user to do MFA, and maybe if the sign-in have high risk, you just block the access all up. And with that, let's move on to Mark that will talk with you about strong authentication deployment tips.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Inbar. So yeah, so that was really good stuff to talk about how we need to think about what we're going to do. And now I'm going to focus on how do we actually go ahead and do some of this stuff. So our first deployment tip here is for our administrators to what they can do from a configuration standpoint. So the first thing we want to recommend is we use that combined security info registration for MFA and self-service password reset. This is really beneficial for a few reasons. One, it's a nice modern flow to let people go through registration. But the second thing is you're getting people to register for both MFA and self-service password reset in one go. An additional benefit of this, the new security registration, is you can now apply conditional access policies to the registration page itself. So we've seen some customers do, in order to actually complete this MFA registration, they need to either come from a corporate device, they maybe need to be on a corporate network via VPN. So whatever you need to do, like those conditional access policies Inbar talked about earlier, you can apply that to this security information registration page. The other thing you should do is if you have the end user's mobile phone numbers already, is you can pre-stage it using the Graph Auth Methods API. So what we've seen customers do is use this Graph call with the previous registration information. So they would pre-stage that information, and then they would put people through the registration flow to get them to register for the Authenticator app. And then they can confirm that the phone number that was registered is accurate. And that way the end users have multiple phone factors registered, which is a best practice. So you go ahead and use both of those together. The third thing here is take a look at our MFA deployment plans at ak.ms/deployment plans/MFA. Our team's done a lot of deployments with a lot of large customers. We walk you through some of the things to think about, like getting stakeholder buy-in, all the kind of different configuration changes you can make. There's some end user collateral that's built in there as well. So basically what we're just trying to say here is you're not starting from scratch. Take a look at this when you're starting to get going, use what you need, discard what you don't, but you're not starting from zero. Take a look at this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, the next tip here is Inbar talked about how important it is to reduce those prompts in our environment. We have a lot of bad stuff that happens where people give up their credentials or all that type of things like that. So how can we go ahead and do that? The first way we can do this, if it's a managed Windows device, is to make sure the device is either hybrid Azure AD joined or Azure AD joined. If it's in one of these two states, you get a special type of token called the primary refresh token that will help reduce those prompts and share the authentication token between applications. If you're coming from an unmanaged Windows device, we want to make sure we're pairing up the persistent browser sessions, the keep me signed in setting, with those sign-in frequency policies. That way we can make sure we're striking that good balance between end users getting prompted at the right amount, but also from a security perspective, we're not maybe letting people be logged in too long on these unmanaged devices. From a mobile perspective on iOS and Android, for both managed and unmanaged, we want to make sure we're using the Authenticator app. This will give you that same type of primary refresh token experience that you get on Windows on the mobile phone. And then for Mac, iOS, and iPadOS, we have the Enterprise SSO plugin that's will give you a similar type of PRT experience on those devices as well. So, and the Mac one is pretty new. If you haven't heard about this, it's probably a few weeks old. So take a look at this. This will really help you cut down on the prompts on those Apple devices. So to learn more about MFA prompts, go to ak.ms/MFA prompts. The third tip here is around deployment to end users. So the first thing is we're gonna have to do some sort of end user communication campaign. Most people do email, but we've seen people do posters in the office. We've seen them do contests. So like whoever is registered by a certain date, they'll do like they'll pull random names out of a hat. Whoever wins gets to do Casual Friday for a month, things like that. We've seen people do gamification. So, whichever team can get all their most users registered by a certain date, they win like a pizza party or whatever, whatever works for your end users and community, you'll kind of know. But there's some tips there, things to think about with that. But you also want to make sure you're communicating to them in a way that helps them understand why we want them to do strong authentication. Most users would rather not have their corporate email on the internet. Nobody wants to be that person. So making sure they understand why we're having them do this goes a really long way in making people to get them to do the right thing. The next thing here is we want to require MFA via conditional access on those key applications to help drive that registration process as well as secure those applications. So things like email is a really good way to do this. Aligning it to when people get paid, they're going to go check their pay stub. They're going to go through that, or going to benefits or HR. At Microsoft, we have an enrollment period for a month where you have to either go in to confirm your benefits or change your benefits. So we've seen customers roll out registration policies around that time because they know everybody's going to click through and complete the registration. Another thing we've seen people get tripped up on is trying to come up with a plan to how all of their users are going to register in their environment, and then they'll start the registration. Do not do this. Register, roll out by groups. Don't wait for that last 5 or 10% of your environment. So most of your users are probably going to be pretty straightforward. Start the registration process with them with that. And while you're figuring out that last 5, 10, 15%, a large chunk of your environment will get registered, and then you'll be able to add those people to that group to complete the registration process. All right, now getting down to some of those passwordless things that Inbar talked about. The first one here is Hello for Business, and we want to make sure that you're deploying key trust wherever possible. There's two types of trust in Hello for Business. There's key trust and cert trust. Key trust is a much easier, smoother deployment. There are only a few reasons why you would need to use cert trust, but really you should default to using key trust unless you really, really need to use cert trust for some specific reasons. Now, if you have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to key trust and cert trust, that's okay. Go to ak.ms/passwordlesswizard. It's this really nice website that we have that asks you questions, walk you through some choices, ask you about your user personas, different types of parts of your environment, and then it will spit out some recommendations and some configuration things you can go do that deployment. Third thing, start with those information workers first. Getting to passwordless is going to be a long journey. Hello for Business is an excellent passwordless method for the users that use the same machine every day. So like one user to one machine, which for a lot of our customers is a large chunk of their information worker force. So go ahead and start with this first, and then you can start adding on the Authenticator app and the FIDO as you go. But Hello for Business is something that will get you to start going to those passwordless methods, and you can do that today. The fourth thing here is to disable the convenience pin via group policy object. There's Hello for Business and there's Windows Hello. And they are two wildly different things, and you cannot go from Windows Hello and the convenience pin to Windows Hello for Business. It's a complete re-registration today. So we don't want to let users get into this state. Let's go ahead and disable that convenience pin feature via group policy before we start deploying Windows Hello for Business. All right, the next one here is Authenticator. So this is really good, as Inbar talked about, is for those non-Windows users. That's like iOS, Android, Mac, Linux, or those BYOD device scenarios. And the first thing here is we want to enable verification codes, because those will work no matter what, no cellular or Wi-Fi connectivity. And then we want to make sure we enable push notifications, which will work without cellular connectivity. It'll work just on your Wi-Fi. But those are still really good multi-factor methods you can use. And then we can step them up into the passwordless world using Windows, or using the Authenticator phone sign-in. The next thing is we want to make sure we enable end user fraud reporting and establish a process for investigation. So our end users are still some of our best security detection mechanisms to report when things seem odd or not normal. So we want to make sure we're doing this for them in the authentication methods as well. So use this as part of that communication you can do when you do those phishing campaigns, right? When you see something suspicious in phishing, say something. When you're seeing something suspicious, we're getting too many prompts, say something. That could be maybe their account has been compromised, or it could be that something is misconfigured and we're over prompting our users. So we want to make sure that users have a way to report this, and we as admins have a process for investigating when those requests come through. And then lastly, educate them about securing their non-work accounts with the Authenticator app as well. We've seen this with some customers. It's a really, really nice way to do this, to say, look, you need to do strong authentication for your work accounts, but you should be doing this for your personal life as well. You should have MFA on for your email. You should have it on for your bank accounts. Those critical accounts, you should have MFA on, just like we're doing for critical applications here at work. And it kind of deputizes them to be these like security people in their personal life, and they go home and they tell their friends and family, hey, are you turning on multi-factor for your email, for your bank accounts? You really, really should. You can use that same Authenticator app for both work and for the personal accounts as well. And then lastly here, for FIDO2 deployments, these are good for the frontline workers and the one user to many machines. So like, think about this in terms of maybe like a factory floor or anything like that. First thing is we want to make sure we plan for that lifecycle management of keys. People are going to lose keys. They're going to wash the key in accident in the washing machine. The dog's going to eat it. They're going to lose them, whatever. We want to make sure we have a process in place for getting them new keys, revoking old keys, just the whole lifecycle management for any of those types of physical devices. And then lastly here, think about logistics specifically to customs. We've had some customers where like 80% of their workforce is one country. They buy all the keys from a vendor in that country, and now they need to ship a bunch of keys that last 10, 15, 20% in another country. It has to go through customs. Depending on the country you're in, depending on the country you're trying to get to, customs can take quite a bit of time to get those keys to those users. It's sometimes easier to, instead of just sending those keys through customs, we actually just source those FIDO keys from another vendor in that country, so we don't have to go through the whole customs process. Okay, so those are some deployment tips. Let's talk about what you should be doing on those day-to-day things of managing strong authentication. The first thing here is use the Azure AD logs. I love Azure AD logs. Inbar loves Azure AD logs. There's such good information in here. So the first thing is, in the auditing logs, you can track the registration of your end users individually. And in the sign-in logs, you should be looking for those failed authentication attempts. This is a really good sign that maybe, again, the user's account has been compromised and they're failing MFA because the user's not letting them through. Or it could be something that's just misconfigured. That's all stuff we want to take a look at. So you can see this in the Azure AD portal, but a lot of customers already have an existing SIEM solution. So if you want to make sure you're getting those logs into that SIEM, you want to use the Azure Monitor Event Hub to do this. So we have some links here for some of the common SIEMs like Splunk, Sumo, QRadar. You can go ahead and have those logs get shipped into those SIEMs for your SOC to take a look at. If you don't have a SIEM, that's okay. You can use Azure Sentinel as well to start doing those same types of things. Now, what should we be looking for in that actual data? There's a few different things. The first thing is we want to use that Authentication Methods Insights dashboard. This gives us a nice high-level overview of the tenant to show how many users have registered for MFA, how many people can do self-service password reset. It's just kind of a nice high-level view of the data that's going on in your tenant. Now, if you want to start answering more specific questions, you want to build your own dashboards, Log Analytics is the best tool to do that with. And if you've never heard of Log Analytics and the language it uses is KQL, that's okay. If you go to aka.ms/AAD Log Analytics Wizard, we set you up on how to get started with KQL. We give you some sample queries to hopefully get you started, and then you can go ahead and build whatever things you want to build. What some of my customers are building per business unit dashboard, so those managements can take a look at this type of stuff, understand how they're doing in their per business unit view. And then last thing here, make sure your users are registering at least 2 different methods or more. And if you go to ak.ms/MFA auth methods analysis, we have a fantastic PowerShell script that you can run at a per user, per group, or at the per tenant level to give you these types of insights and give you some recommendations about what your users have done from a registration perspective. So you want to make sure you're running this on a periodic basis to make sure that we have multiple methods registered and other types of good recommendations are in here. This is a free PowerShell script. Go take a look at this, run it in your environment. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Inbar to give us a quick recap and those go-dos. Inbar and I love it when people actually go and do the stuff we talk about, not just talk about it. So she's going to give us the last steps to go be successful.
Thanks, Mark. So yes, let's wrap up with some go-dos. First of all, I want to let you know about this URL, AKMS Go Passwordless, if you want to read more about all of our passwordless methods. Now let's talk about a few things you can do in the next 7, 30, and 90 days after our presentation if you want to enable strong authentication. A few things I want to highlight is in the next week, you can start testing the different authentication methods that we have in Azure AD and enforce MFA for all of your admin account. This is a no-brainer. Your admin account needs to be enforced with MFA. Then in the next 30 days, you might be gradually rolling this MFA requirement for the IT department as the first department that will start using MFA. And you can start the email campaign and user communication that Mark was talking about. And then finally, in the next 90 days, we really hope that you will be gradually rolling out strong authentication for all your users in the tenant, and hopefully you'll get eventually to this 100% of use cases. And with that, we're here in the chat, so hit us up with questions and we're waiting for him to hear from you. Thank you.